Hey, it's Kevin with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, we are going to have a returning guest, but in a different capacity. We're going to have Mike Myers join us. And Mike, you may remember from a different company, but now Mike has started his own company and he's come on the podcast to tell us all about it. He's just announced it last week, and now we're excited to dive deeper and learn more about it. He is the founder now of Lully AI. So, Mike, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Excited to learn about what you've been up to here and kind of behind the scenes a little bit and now coming out here into the open and putting the spotlight on Lolly here. So I guess maybe for people that are not familiar with you or maybe haven't heard you on some of our previous episodes, tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how that's led up to the founding of this company Lowly, which we'll dive into a little deeper here in a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I started off my career really focused on process improvement, continuous improvement, automation system deployment within 3PLs and retailers. After doing some time there, I moved on to a automation org where I've spent the last 4 years. And during my time in the 3PL space specifically, uh, I had observed some efficiency improvement opportunities, we'll say, that were
Mm,
really hard to deliver on, but were definitely there for the taking if you could figure out the problem. And that thought process became the basis for what Lolly has become.
mm. Very interesting. Yeah, yeah. And tell us too, because you told me this before recording, but I think this is important to know. The name Lully, where does the name Lully come from?
Yeah, so there was a gentleman named John Baptiste Lully who was the first recorded conductor. So when you think of orchestra's orchestration, that gentleman was the first to step up and do it and get credit or acknowledgement for it. And I kind of fell in love with that idea of orchestration. And that's really where we're heading. It's not where we are today, but that's the North Star, so to speak. So I wanted to give a bit of homage to that gentleman.
Gotcha. All right, and I love that, and I think that's such a kind of a great name story there, and I
Yeah.
think it leads itself to what you're trying to do, as you mentioned. Getting into the orchestration part of it. But tell us now. We've talked about the name and kind of your background and what you're looking at, and so tell us a little bit about what is Lully, and what are you focused on, and I guess what was the actual initial problem that you saw and wanted to go after in pursuing Lully.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Wally over time will become a full fledged orchestration platform. And I say over time primarily because uh, when I think of orchestration, that's not a thing that we really need today.
Mm,
When I think about orchestration, it's disparate systems that you need to make decisions about, provide guidance into on how to go execute whatever that task set may be, right? But there's not a lot of warehouses in the world today that have, you know, AMRs and goods to person system operating in the same building.
mm,
80-ish% of warehouses have no automation. All right.
yeah.
So we started focusing in that space and really very specifically on e-commerce or unit level picking. So fulfillment operations primarily. And where we're focused is really trying to give those manual operations the ability to see drastic improvements in efficiency without having to deploy hardware, right? So when you think about the space today, uh, goods to person system, right? Shelf to person, AMRs, what have you, even some of the voice picking, right? They all require some type of hardware deployment
Right.
and they have a software component. So what we set out to do is just do that software component, do that puzzle solving to a degree that hadn't been done in the space yet.
Hmm. Very interesting. Yeah. And I think, I love the fact that you're saying, without the hardware, right?
Mhm.
Because, oftentimes too, I think a lot of what we see in the industry right now, and, especially we'll say on a marketing front too, right? Is like, oh, to do real improvement or make real transformation, like you need to bring in robots or you need to bring in some type of hardware to do that. So I think that's a really, really interesting approach there.
Yeah, yeah, I think, and it resonates well with the end user, right? So
Mm,
if they're one of these organizations that they have no automation, or they've just dipped their toe into automation in one building, right?
mm,
Um, they have some set of experiences. There may be concern about taking that step. And what we're trying to do is say, well, there's actually another way to do it that's not as risky, right? Not to say that automation is inherently risky, but
mm,
anytime you're making that drastic of a change, there is some change management that comes with it. There is learning curve. There is the adoption component, right? And we're trying to stick within the constraints of the processes and the systems that you have today and just make them better, right? So how do we apply intelligence to what you're already doing
yeah.
without re-engineering the whole thing?
Interesting. And so, when we look at that, I mean, there's certainly a lot of things going on in our space, right? I mean, you have, I think there's two sides of it to look at it, right? I mean, one is that like, wow, there's tons of things happening in our space from a technology perspective,
Yeah,
whether it's software, hardware. That's wow, this is exciting, right? To be in this space and be able to see all these kind of things happening. And the other side is, to your point, like, wow, to start to bring some of these things in, there's a lot of change management. Maybe it's overwhelming in a sense, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of companies out there that are, working to, I guess we would say like revolutionize, right, warehouse management and do all this transformation and, take you to the next level, whatever kind of buzzwords or taglines you want to use there. So from Lully's perspective, I mean, what makes you different from some of these other ones that are trying to be so revolutionary?
yeah. So I think from the onset, we're not trying to be revolutionary, right?
Okay, that's
Uh,
definitely different.
yeah.
Yeah.
So one, I just don't like that term. Like
Mm,
how many things are actually revolutionary, right? But
yeah.
two, we are specifically attempting to be evolutionary in the sense of
Mm,
you already have systems in place. You have a ERP or a WMS or an OMS or whatever it is, right? You have processes that are within those systems. How do we just
mm,
leverage those things to get more volume out without changing everything about it, without doing complicated integrations, without forcing you into an operating mode or paradigm that you don't already exist in, right? How do we achieve those things? So that's really the focus, right? Is a customer comes in and says, I am uh, cluster picking, I am separating out my singles, I'm on order pickers and pallet jacks and carts. Uh,
mm,
how can we make it better? And then we come in and apply one just thought process, good kind of, I'll say, consulting services that we don't charge for it, right? To say,
okay.
hey, I see some opportunities here. Like, let's shift this way, let's shift
Mhm,
that way. But then we get into the real fun of it, of applying mathematics to the problem to get you to a better outcome, a better result. Uh,
mm,
a gentleman that I crossed path. Oh man, you're gonna have to edit this part, Kevin.
sure.
Crossed paths with before. Uh, he worked at Kiva in the very early days, and he gave
Okay.
this example that I absolutely love. He was talking with a customer about how put away logic would apply what they called peanut butter and jelly. It would get
Mm,
the peanut butter and the jelly next to each other on the shelves, right? And then that would in turn make your picking more efficient.
mm,
But it turns out that they didn't really have this peanut butter and jelly. thought process, right? It was a sales pitch, it wasn't reality. Uh,
Okay.
but if you think about it, it's exactly what you would want, right? If you were going into a grocery store to pick orders, uh, and you had 100 orders for peanut butter and jelly and 100 orders for spaghetti and sauce, you know intuitively that you want to pick all the peanut butter and jelly orders together and
Yeah.
you want to pick all the spaghetti and sauce orders together, right? Like we don't need any math to figure that out. That's the intuitive part. But when you expand that out across the full warehouse, a full SKU assortment, a full slotting profile, and wherever you're storing and picking from, that problem space just becomes absolutely massive. And then you start layering on the different equipment types, the different capabilities that they have, the different people, their different capabilities. Now it's a thing that's really hard for an individual, a person generating waves or batches to put any high level quality of thought into, right? Like it's almost such a big problem that starting to break it down uh, in real time is unfathomable. Like you don't even have a good starting place. And then as a result, you end up with this mode of operation that almost everybody follows of, all right, I'm going to get all my singles out and then I'm going to get all
Mm.
my multis. Maybe I break it into 2 lines and 2+ lines, whatever it may be. But what they're trying to do is create that peanut butter and jelly experience just by segmentation, right? Just
Yeah.
by, all right, I'm going to get all my singles and then kind of naturally, I'm going to make sure that they're picked together like items,
Yeah.
right? Multis, 2 lines, it's smaller pick quantity. I'm trying to control the number of places I have to go to on this trip. You get out to the large orders, and we kind of just accept that it's going to be painful and slow. Uh, we're trying to say that that's actually not how you need to operate. Like there is a way to figure that problem out, and there's a way to give you real meaningful efficiency uh, just by leveraging the systems and the processes that you already have.
Mm. Very interesting. And so, I mean, you're kind of saying in a sense that, that traditional way of thinking, right? Which I think a lot of us have probably fallen into, which you're mentioning there, putting those kind of complementary products near each other and then, picking them all together at the same time. And, maybe even, the traditional sense of slotting in a sense too. I mean, you're kind of saying that that's not necessarily the most efficient way to do things. Is that correct?
So slotting will give you
Mm,
phenomenal results, and it's a thing you should do.
mhm.
What I'm saying is that slotting isn't enough. So
I see. Okay.
unless you can figure out how your trips are going to be constructed with consideration to slotting, you're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table, right? So if we go back to the peanut butter and jelly example, right?
Sure.
If if for some reason that grocery store has the spaghetti next to the peanut butter and it's not quite
Mm.
as intuitive, you would now want to consider that, right? And you would want to make sure that the orders that had spaghetti and peanut butter on that order go out together. Or if you have singles of just peanut butter, let's go back to kind of the normal approach to a grocery layout. If you have an order for just peanut butter, should you send that out as singles?
Mm.
Or should it be on the trip that already has other peanut butter and jelly orders?
Mm. Interesting. You're asking me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say I guess it would be on the trip with other peanut butter and jelly because you're going to be at peanut butter, right?
Right. You're already there.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you're, I love that you're personally, I love that you're using the grocery store example because, I think it's probably my operations background and
Okay.
mindset. But whenever I go to the grocery store, I'm like, what's my optimal pick path here? Because I want to be in and out, right? I'm going like I'm always going to the same grocery store because I know the
Yep.
layout, I know where the stuff is, and I'm gonna like blow through this list as
Yeah. Yeah.
fast as
Yeah.
I can, right? So I think it's a very interesting approach there. But and so you're saying that you're utilizing the existing system. You're not bringing in any additional hardware. So what? I mean, what is Lully actually doing? Like, it's plugging into the WMS, or how does that
Yeah.
portion of it work?
Yeah. So whatever that host system is, it can be ERP, can be a WMS and OMS. It doesn't really matter a whole lot, but we're going to
Okay.
sit a level above that. And depending on how uh, your system actually behaves and functions, we can plug in at different points. So we've
Mm,
built in flexibility where, as an example, we can do allocation for you if that makes the most sense based on the way that your system's actually designed. Uh, we can also not do allocation. We can accept your system's allocations and
mm,
plug in later into the process, right? But all of these systems go through very, very similar steps, right? I have orders that come in, they're sitting in some type of entry status, we'll say.
mm,
I then collect the orders into a wave or a batch or whatever the terminology is. Now, in the background, locations are allocated against based on the orders in that wave or batch. And then last step is I'm going to segment that waiver batch into trips through the facility, right? That's kind of the general steps that every system follows. Depending on the complexity of that system, there may be different human touch points that exist there, but by and large, it follows that same flow. So what we've built is the capability to handle that full process of from entry through release to an end user, a picker, or any of the individual steps or components in the stream. So we can plug in anywhere in there. But what we're ultimately getting is a API request that gives
mm.
us a status of the warehouse, gives us the facts that we need to make a decision or determination. We're going to chew on that information, and then we're going to provide that back to the system, whatever it is, for them to go and execute on. So we're going to provide the instruction back of here's how you should actually waive these. Here's how you should actually chunk these orders into trips through the facility. And based on the configuration, we're ultimately trying to minimize SLA breakage, right? Like trying to stay on target with on time shipping. And then at a second level, trying to minimize how far you're having to travel through the facility,
Mm.
how many stops you have to make on each trip, and trying to maximize the utilization of cube of that trip. So how do we get the right mix of orders onto the vehicle, but also utilize the vehicle to its fullest capacity?
Interesting. So, I mean, so you're looking at it in multiple different layers there to be able to kind of optimize that pick overall. Um, Now I mean, it sounds like it's system agnostic, right? I mean, just can work with any WMS basically.
In theory, right? So we need the WMS
Okay,
to play
sure.
ball to a degree, but
Hmm.
we are intentionally by design as system agnostic as you can be, right? So the all of the nomenclature is what's broadly used, right? We didn't do a lot of
Mm.
fancy naming there,
Yeah.
um, and then because of the different capabilities that we have and the ability to plug in at all these different points in that work stream, we're about as system agnostic as possible.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah, and I think that's definitely important, right? Because you're trying to address a problem essentially without it sounds like the goal is to address a problem without a heavy lift on the operations side, right?
Yeah.
Meaning, like, no new software, no hardware, as you mentioned, bringing that in, which I think is really interesting, and obviously, definitely a value, I think, to the company to
Mhm.
be able to not have that big lift, because then you don't necessarily have like that whole change management process and all these things going on, and I imagine you can see some gains probably quicker than in some other avenues that you could go. So I mean, does the end user even know like that they're working with Lully? I mean, or is it just working in the background, kind of making these things happen?
Yeah, so it depends on the environment and the customer.
Mm,
So
okay.
you know, there's one environment where the end users definitely know. They've been very excited about it. We've been very close to the pickers, we'll say, and the packers, and
Okay.
understanding the feedback and how things have gone, et cetera. But there's another world where they don't know it all.
Mm,
The people downstream who are actually executing the work do not know that it's in place. Uh, they did notice that they were uh, getting a bit more done without the overtime, and they were
mhm.
excited about that to a degree.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um, but in terms of actually being able to place a name or a cause to it, they
Mm.
can't necessarily identify it.
Interesting, interesting. So they can actually tell that they are picking a little more
Hmm.
efficiently, essentially.
Hmm.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
it's an odd thing to ask somebody about because the they can see the numbers at the end of the day, and that tells a
Right.
story, and that's awesome. But if you ask
Mm,
them how they feel about it, um, it's interesting because they'll notice it, but it's sometimes hard to put their finger exactly on what it is or what's different,
right.
right?
Interesting, interesting. I mean, tell us a little bit about, because you've had some earlier customers here that you're working with, right? I guess kind of in stealth mode. You've
Yep.
been here a little bit, right? So tell us a little bit about what have they seen in terms of those gains. I mean, you just said some of the numbers are improved, and some of the pickers feel the difference, right? And less overtime, right? And I think some of the pickers are probably grateful. Some are probably like, "Oh, I love overtime," right?
Exactly.
Maybe,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
there's a balance there, certainly. But tell us a little bit about kind of the some of the gains and results that some of these early customers have seen from implementing Lully.
Yeah. So I'll speak to one in particular because it's already out in the open. So
Sure.
uh, they've experienced around 35% improvement just in picking,
Oh wow.
right?
Yeah.
So just picking operations. We haven't gone through and perfectly quantified packing, but we've identified that there's definitely a lift in the packing operation as well, just
Mm,
because orders are flowing more consistently. So as a result of keeping a stream going, there's less downtime in the packing operation. There's less waiting at the beginning of the day to just get going. Uh, then we have a big change coming with them here soon. We're going to move them from tote based picking to picking directly into the shipping carton. Uh,
mm,
that has some huge benefits. So, because we're going to be able to dynamically size the trip, there's no more static engagement on the actual vehicle where we don't have just 12 orders or 15 orders or whatever it is per trip, but we can actually cube that vehicle out based on the cartons to get an increased order density per trip.
mm.
Uh, all in all, excluding packing operations, we're expecting about another 30-35% lift in picking from that implementation.
Oh wow. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's huge gains, definitely,
Yep.
especially when you consider, like we've been talking here and about not really adding anything, right?
Not really.
Like
Yeah.
not adding in like another tool or a different scanner or whatever
Right.
the case may be. I mean, just rearranging a sense in the way that they're going to go about that pick path, or the even just what they're going to put the item into, I think is can be a big change there as well. So it's very interesting to hear that, and the success that you've already had with the Lully solution. So now, I mean, tell us a little bit about kind of the contrast of
If
putting in.
if I
Well,
could pause you just really quick,
oh sure.
yeah, can we
Yeah.
expand on that a little?
Yeah, yeah, go
You
ahead.
sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Um, so I think that uh, that particular instance is awesome, but we showed
Mm,
up and they already had a pretty good process, a pretty good picking application. The system was already doing the things it was supposed to do by and large, right? So it's still phenomenal improvement to see 35%, right? That's great.
Yeah.
But I would categorize them as somewhat advanced, right, in terms of the system that they already had. When we
Okay.
go downstream and we look at some of the operations that don't have that same level of sophistications in the systems already, we're actually expecting significantly more improvement. So we have a customer that's in process of onboarding today. And again, just picking, we're expecting actually around a 4x improvement, which is insane, right? Uh,
Yeah.
Absolutely massive SKU base. So as the SKU base gets larger, the problem space gets larger. Um, the storage is spread out throughout the whole facility. Picking is occurring throughout the whole facility. It's around 200,000 square feet, give or take. Uh,
Mm.
but when you stack all those facts up, it becomes a really hard problem for WMS and ERP, whoever it is, to actually solve it, right? So
Yeah.
when we go downstream to the less sophisticated operations, we're expecting significantly more lift.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, it's so impressive. I'll say again that, the gain there, without, right, these, hardware or,
Yeah,
a totally new WMS or anything like that, being able to kind of just, pick out these pieces that you're doing there and put these layers on to be able to continuously kind of improve and gain those processes. So I'm curious, I mean, in that regard, right? And I'll say, I know you, right?
yeah, yeah,
Obviously for a while now, and when you told me what you were doing, I was surprised, right, that it didn't have to do with automation or robotics in some way because you've been involved in that for a little bit now, and so I'm curious. I mean, what's your view on the mobile robotics, right, versus what you're doing now. I mean, obviously you're in favor of what you're
yeah,
doing
yeah,
now,
of
so
course.
right,
Yeah,
sure. But I mean, why did you look at that, doing something like this versus doing something with the mobile robotics? I know you said earlier in the conversation, the goal is long term to get to orchestration, and be able to encompass that as well. But I mean, where do you think we are as an industry that made you go in this direction?
yeah, that's a totally fair question.
Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of things at play. So I've fallen out of love, we'll say, with the PA AMR market.
Okay.
Um, it's not that they don't have tremendous value in the right environment, in the right with the right implementation, right? They
Mm,
absolutely do. My hypothesis is that those environments are far less common than
mm,
what the marketing material would lead you to believe. So the customer that I was just discussing, right? They're picking everywhere. They're on order pickers 30 feet in the air. How do I deploy a PA AMR in that environment without
right.
changing everything? I now need that
Yeah.
system to do replenishment, right? I now need different waving strategies entirely. I likely don't have enough square footage to even pull it off.
Mm,
How do I exist there, right? When we get into the full landscape of all the warehouses, there are more operations like that are primarily one shift, two shift operations
mm,
that I believe we can provide a better net cost per unit benefit than, frankly, any of the PA AMRs on the market. When you get to
mm,
three shifts, the math starts to tilt towards the PA AMRs over the long run. In the short
mm,
run, we're still favorable, right? So if you're looking over a 1 to 2 year horizon, I think we can still win there. When you get out to the 3 to 4 year, the PAAMRs tend to perform better.
Hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, yeah, and I think it's interesting too because oftentimes you hear that you want to fully optimize everything before you move to
Hmm.
robotics, right, or automation, which makes a lot of sense, right? You automate a bad process, and you're just making that process
Or
faster,
yeah,
but it's still bad, right?
yeah,
So being able to do that and have this kind of I mean, would you say it's almost like a bridge in a sense, like Lully, to further optimize, like get as much out of what you have currently, and then like you said, in that 2 to 4 year period later, now you're bringing in robotics and automation, and I
yeah.
mean, is that kind of like the roadmap or timeline you're looking at with Lully?
So I think that that can be a reasonable approach. I think that there's still going to be profiles and industries that never go down that path, or at least
Mm,
not in the next 5 to 10 years. Uh, but uh, yeah, optimizing the thing that you already have is obviously going to provide a phenomenal financial benefit
mm,
here and now, which is great. But if PAAMRs or whatever the technology is ultimately your target, the big benefit is that we can just help you get a better price on it, right? So at the end
mm,
of the day, uh, because we're going to bring your operating costs down to a degree, a lot of the robot as a service providers have a lot of assumptions about what your pick densities are, what your pick rates are, what
mm,
your labor costs are, and those are all bubbled up to generate a top line cost, right? Well, if we're breaking that mold, if we're making those assumptions untrue, uh, well, when you go to do that implementation, now you have a much better leg to stand on to bring that cost down from that supplier.
mm. Gotcha. Interesting. Interesting. So leveraging Lully as a negotiation point,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. And reap all the benefits along the
Definitely.
way, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting because it is, as you said, in there was that, as these environments where these mobile robots are running all around the place, is much less than, like you said, that some of these marketing and things out there would lead you to believe,
Hmm.
right? And I think there is still a big contingent of operators and warehouses that are still a little probably skeptical on the robot side, or just thinking that it's kind of out of reach for them,
Sure.
and realize that their operation is not necessarily where it should be, or even feasible to bring that in. So having this option, I think, that you're bringing to market is certainly a great way to get further optimization out of what they've already attempted to do, and try to bring that in. So tell us a little bit about, and I think one of those big hurdles too for probably the operators around like automation or robotics is the idea of implementation and the deployment, and like you said, all the other things that might need to change about my infrastructure
Hmm.
to make them even viable, right? So tell us a little bit about what does it look like to bring Lully into your operation. I mean, what does the implementation deployment look like? How long does it take? I mean, what is the project like?
Yeah. The project can be about as fast as your resources are willing to move in terms of getting us data. But the first step for us is to generate a map of the facility. So we're going to create
Mm,
a 3D map of your operation, all of the locations, all of the coordinates, your rules of the road, one-way aisles, two-way aisles, four-way aisles, whatever it may be. And then we're going to digitize equipment. So we're going to create digital representations of your order pickers, their constraints, your carts, your pallet jacks, whatever it may be. And then from there, we're going to look at how you're operating today. Like, how are you creating trips? What levers are you pulling on to do that? And then we're going to try to simulate, based on what you're doing today, based on how we would have given you picks, we're going to simulate what your world would look like in the future. And from there, if we all agree that, all right, there's value to be had, there's opportunity to move forward, then we will look at system flow with you. We'll help you understand, from our perspective at least, how your system is actually operating today, that WMS or ERP, whatever it may be, and where the best insertion points are for Lully. And then it's just about establishing the communication, right? So establishing uh, the when your system is actually going to make the request to us, what that timing looks like, how you're going to process the response, what you're going to do with it in terms of constructing the trips, etc. But end to end, if everyone is on their game, it could be as short as a month engagement to get up and running. Like from first conversation to flipping the switch, it can be within a month.
Hmm. Nice, and I think that's a great time. I mean, short time frame to be able to start to realize some of those gains that you were talking about earlier there too, as well. So now you mentioned creating, these digital representation of the operation and the equipment and things like that. I mean, is that a digital twin that you're creating, or what? How do you look at that?
Yes and no. So in the way that the market talks about digital twins today,
Sure.
sure, it probably qualifies.
Okay.
We don't talk about it as a digital twin. So this is an area that we want to explore in the future. But if you think about what a digital twin and where its value really comes from, it's trying to evaluate these what ifs, right? What
Sure.
if I changed my order releases or my schedule or whatever it may be, whatever questions you're trying to ask about the operation. But until you're instrumenting all of the equipment and really understanding where it is in time and space throughout the day of an operation, you can't really fully answer those questions without making a long list of assumptions, right?
Right.
So, in my mind today, nobody truly has a digital twin. It might be a
Okay.
little controversial, but I don't know anyone who's instrumenting every piece of equipment in a facility and then truly able to fully answer those what if scenarios.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. 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 I was curious about that because I know you mentioned there on LinkedIn, right? That you thought digital twins maybe were like inflated a little bit
Yeah.
in the way that they've been talked about. So interesting there, and an interesting perspective on that for sure. Now, as we look towards the future, I mean, I know you guys are just getting started,
Yeah.
just getting out there. What does the kind of future roadmap for Lowly look like? Because it sounds like from the beginning of our conversation, like this is kind of the first kind of addressable thing that you're tackling, but then there's going to be some expansion beyond that.
Yeah. So we're going to go eventually play in the slotting world, uh, but
Okay.
in a little bit different way. So because we know truly how trips are constructed, what the tasks truly were, it's not
Mm.
just going to be about distance minimization, which is what you typically see. So
Right.
there's kind of this concept of dropping an origin, a 0, 0 point on the map, and then, you know, splaying the inventory around that from that 0, 0 point. And we think that that's leaving a lot to be desired. So we'll go play in that space. That's coming up. The other area that we think is really interesting is really retail fulfillment or case fulfillment operations.
Okay.
So that expansion is relatively straightforward from our side, but we have a few unique spins that we want to put on it based on the problems that exist in that space. So if you think
Mhm.
about shipping to Macy's, let's say, or Nordstrom or whoever, they all have their own unique requirements about palletization, labeling, what have you. And it all
Mhm.
ties back to the picking and execution side. So we're going to figure out what we can do in that world. And then finally, uh, we'll say pallet task interleaving. So if you imagine that there's a lot of warehouses in the world that are still moving pallets, There's been a
Yeah.
big shift, right, to eaches and cases, absolutely, but there's still a lot of
Right.
folks moving pallets, and a lot of folks who either have never been able to try interleaving of task, or have tried it and failed for whatever reason. We think that we're actually relatively well positioned to work on that problem in the same way that we've attacked the each picking or unit picking problem.
Mm. Very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, the idea of the interleaving of tasks, I think, is very interesting, right? Because as you mentioned there, like, there's been a lot of now variation in, I guess, the form factor, you could say, of, how product is getting moved around, whether it's, maybe it's coming in the building on pallets, but then it's going into cases and then it's coming down to eaches, or, even maybe the reverse way, or
Mm-hmm.
something of the nature. And I think it does create a lot of complexities for operations to be able to handle, right? So very interesting to hear that, and I'm interested to see how you kind of tackle that, and continue to evolve, and also the slotting problem as well. And it'd be interesting to see how Lully continues to grow. So now, for people that are listening and maybe are curious about, learning more about Lully, I mean, who would be like your ideal customer right now? I mean, who's like a good fit for the problem you're solving?
Yeah, so I think anyone who's out there each picking on either order pickers or pallet jacks or carts, whatever the vehicle is, but
Mhm.
you're doing some type of each picking, you, because of the way that we're set up from a financial model, we're not overly sensitive about volume, right?
Mm.
If you're shipping 50 orders a day, probably not going to see a massive improvement. But when you get into the 500 orders plus a day, we think that that's a
Okay.
place that we can play pretty nicely. And then, of course, the more volume, the better, right? So even if it's 5, 10, 15,000 orders a day, we're still really comfortable in that space. But, if you're picking the tote, if you're picking the shipper, if you're on some type of manual equipment, we likely can make you better today, uh,
Mm.
relatively straightforward.
Nice, nice. All right. Definitely very good there. And from 500 orders to 10,000, that's a good range, I'll
Yep,
say,
yep.
for sure. And really appreciate you coming on here, Mike, and telling us about your new venture here, and what you're up to. And we really appreciate you thinking of us to kind of help you make this announcement and get the news out here. Very exciting stuff. And I think, what stands out to me the most is certainly the fact that, there's no additional hardware, no additional real software or infrastructure kind of changes that need to be made. And you can still get some great improvements, as you kind of said there, from some of these earlier customers
Hmm.
you've been working with. So really appreciate you coming on and sharing this with us. Now, if people want to learn more, get in touch, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. Uh, Feel free to find me on LinkedIn, pretty active there. But also, lolly.ai is the URL. I also have a pretty active LinkedIn page for Lully that people are free to engage with, and look forward to hearing about the problems that they're trying to solve.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information in the show notes here, and also at the newwarehouse.com. And I will definitely testify that Mike is very active on LinkedIn. Some of the most insightful, in depth comments, I think, out there on LinkedIn, I will say. So definitely connect with him, and definitely head to the Lily site to learn more. So, Mike, it's been a pleasure to get you on today to learn about what you're doing with Lily, and we look forward to hearing about what the future holds as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Kevin.
Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning into today's video here on our YouTube channel, the New Warehouse Podcast, and I appreciate you tuning in. If you liked what you saw, make sure you subscribe to our channel, and if you like this video in particular, make sure you like it as well. And if you want to get this great t-shirt that you see in the video behind me, Warehouses Are Sexy, head to warehousesaresexy.com and get your own.